If we plan to hike hundreds of miles on the Appalachian Trail, getting decent sleep and enough of it is going to be a priority. I've seen hikers sleeping in the middle of the day and hiking at night, but I think most of us probably will be sleeping at night, and that will be our topic here. We will take a detailed look not only at sleeping gear, but also at a number of other considerations and decisions we'll be making about sleeping on the AT. One of those decisions is how much sleeping will we be doing in the wooden shelters and lean-tos along the AT. Many hikers sleep in these shelters and lean-tos whenever they can. I sleep in them only when I have to. This is just a preference. Even if I don't sleep in the shelter itself, most such shelters have designated tent sites nearby. The great majority of my nights on the AT have been spent sleeping at such spots. I plan to talk more about shelters in detail in another video. In some locations, like the Smoky Mountain National Park, at some times of the year, AT hikers are required to sleep in shelters. There are other regulations at certain spots along the trail that affect where we sleep. I'll also be discussing these rules in more detail in a future video. However, at many other spots along the AT, in particular national forests, AT hikers can pitch their tent practically anywhere, which is often called stealth camping. I have done a lot of stealth camping. The main reason is if I get to a shelter in late afternoon or early evening, sometimes I see no need to stop even if I know I can't make it to the next shelter. This approach has an element of risk involved in that I am making a bet that I can find a spot to camp before dark. The risk comes from the fact that much of the AT is far too hilly to camp on. Official AT maps and David Miller's guidebook show elevations on the trail in the form of a profile that goes up and down as if viewed from the side. With a glance at one of these profiles, I can tell if I have high spots in front of me, and many of these high spots will be ridges or hilltops. I have had repeated success finding a flat place to camp on at these ridges and hilltops. Often I can spot these flat places from the trail, and sometimes I step off the trail 20 yards or so for a better look. I have found many decent places close to the trail. In some places a tent site has to be a certain distance from the trail. Even though I stealth camp a lot, I don't want to make it sound like I'm recommending it for everyone. On the other hand, if a hiker glances at ridges and hilltops he or she passes, they can get a pretty decent idea of how they would fare if they want to try stealth camping. And if they decide it's a bad idea, it's their choice to make. One advantage of shelters is you tend to wake up when everyone else does. I always carry a portable alarm clock and find it almost a necessity when in my tent. As I said in an earlier video, I try to hit the sack at 10 p.m. and get up at 7:30 a.m., and the alarm clock helps me do this. Another thing that has helped me sleep at night on the AT is a set of earplugs. One night, a large number of insects were making a horrible racket that lasted all night. I slept through it thanks to these earplugs, and I can still hear the alarm clock when I have the plugs in. Another detail is I always take time to hang my food bag, usually in a tree. We do this to keep animals from getting our food, and I'll also be talking about this more in a future video. Another good idea when stealth camping is to look above our potential tent site to make sure no large dead tree branches or leaning dead trees are above us. Those things will fall down eventually, and we don't want to be there when it happens. Once on the AT, I heard a tree fall over in the middle of the night. It must have been a big one because it sounded like a bomb going off. It took me a long time to figure out that if I sleep on my back in my tent, it's much easier for me to sleep comfortably compared to sleeping on my side. For a lot of us, if not most of us, a sleeping pad is something that will help us sleep more comfortably. It's helpful to test a tent spot first by laying a sleeping pad on the ground and trying it out to see if we can lie there in reasonable comfort. Once on a hillside, I put my pad on a slight depression that was at a right angle to the slope, and I put the tent over that. With this history of mine and these techniques, I have found that my requirements for a sleeping pad are pretty modest. And before we leave the subject of tent sites, let's talk about groundwater that's put there by heavy rainfall. Generally speaking, on the Appalachian Trail, there is not very much of a risk that we will have heavy rain either draining under and around our tent or pooling around our tent. Most of the terrain around the Appalachian Trail is quite hilly. Prepared tent sites have been well chosen, and if we stealth camp at a flat spot, we usually have a lot of steep slope nearby to carry water away. For the benefit of those backpacking in other areas of the country, we'll talk about this more a little later. I have used nothing but closed cell sleeping pads on the AT, and each of these 4 have been on the AT. On the right is a 3/4 ridge rest. Next to it is a full-length ridge rest. The green one is a Coleman model I cut down to be about 20 inches wide, and the last one is so old I don't even remember where the heck I got it. For those who don't know, the idea behind a 3/4 length sleeping pad is that we put at least our shoulders and hips on it, and maybe our head, while the rest of our legs are either lying on a ground sheet or maybe on something else like an empty backpack. One of the main original points behind a sleeping pad is to insulate us from the cold ground, but each of these sleeping pads will give us a softer surface to sleep on than we otherwise might find with the bare ground. I have never used an inflatable sleeping pad on the AT because there's some kind of chance always an inflatable pad might fail. There's no way a closed cell pad will deflate on me. I used this 3/4 inflatable thermarest pad off of the AT for about 10 years, and ultimately it developed a tear that wrecked it. Here we see it after I put duct tape on that tear in a failed effort to repair it. If we carry a pad like this on the AT, it would be a very good plan to carry a repair kit with us. This is a big Agnes 3/4 pad that I've used often when I haven't been on the AT, and I like it. It has a couple of advantages, one of which is it's a couple of inches thick. Another advantage is it will fit the stuff sack that came with it, and not all outdoor gear will do that. By comparison, a thermarest is self-inflating. You have to blow up the big Agnes. It can easily get below 60 degrees at night on the AT in the summer, but thru hikers in the south are going to be facing much colder temperatures than that when they start off in the early weeks of their hike. Whether it's winter or summer, I always have extra clothes that I carry to put on when I sleep. In the summer, I put on a pullover long sleeve fleece shirt and I wear a fleece hat. In the winter, I've used a down jacket. It's a good plan on the AT to set aside a pair of thick socks and use them only for sleeping. As I said, northbound AT thru hikers can easily encounter freezing temperatures and snow in the early weeks of their trip, and many of them will start off carrying a sleeping bag rated for at least 20 degrees, and some of them will carry bags rated for lower temperatures. Additionally, some hikers will carry that cold weather bag for their entire hike, yet some will switch to a summer bag as it gets warmer. Many of us will select a down-filled sleeping bag for the Appalachian Trail, and for many of us who do, it's often a big decision whether we want to spend the extra money to get a sleeping bag like that. Aside from the money, another big factor in making this decision is determining how much weight we want to be carrying. Synthetic sleeping bags are cheaper than down bags, but synthetic bags are heavier. This is a Western Mountaineering Highlight 100% down-filled bag, which costs about $330 in 2015. This is my most expensive piece of backpacking gear, and I spent a lot of time agonizing over whether I should buy it. And it also, incidentally, is rated for 35 degrees. Compare that to this synthetic sleeping bag I bought at a surplus store. It's probably good for 40 degrees and it weighs 2 pounds. I think I paid about $60 for it, and it also has been on the AT. This is a 20-degree down bag and it weighs 2 pounds, which is somewhat typical for a 20-degree down-filled bag. By comparison, I went to the REI website and clicked on the first synthetic bag I saw. It was a Kelty Dualist 22. It's rated for 22 degrees for men. It costs about $160 and weighs 3 pounds, 5 ounces. More than a pound heavier than this down bag. We must always remember that if a down-filled bag gets quite wet, it won't keep us warm and it will be very slow to dry. Before I went to the AT, I had camped in enough bad conditions to be almost 100% sure I could keep my sleeping bag dry no matter what. On rare times when I got drops of water on the down bag, it did not affect the performance of my bag that I could tell. Some sleeping bags are a combination of down and synthetic fill. They are cheaper but heavier than a 100% down bag. This is a backpacking quilt that I made myself. The idea behind a backpacking quilt is you drape it over you and count on the sleeping pad beneath you to keep you warm from the ground. This quilt was made with synthetic material and is good for about 40 degrees. While a synthetic 40-degree sleeping bag might weigh 2 pounds, This quilt weighs 1.5 pounds, and that is the advantage of a quilt. A quilt is always a bit lighter than a comparable sleeping bag. The folded over area you see at one end has been sewed together to form a pocket, and that's where I put my feet. I often use a sleeping bag just like I would a quilt, which is to say I drape it over me and I don't bother to zip it up. I have done this in freezing temperatures. If the idea of a backpacking quilt appeals to you, I would recommend doing a thorough online search. I would expect that you will find places that will sell down quilts or give you plans that will help you make one. We can get a little more warmth if we use a sleeping bag liner. This is a breathable Adventure Medical Kit's Escape Light Bivy, and I've used it as a liner. I pulled it up to about my armpits, and that did help keep me warmer. When I tried pulling it up to my neck, it tore at this particular spot. It's only 31 inches wide, and that's not enough room for me to be moving around in when it's over my shoulders. Another option for snow and cold temperatures that's pretty reliable is putting a Mylar emergency blanket under our sleeping pad. I put it under the pad so the sleeping bag would not be sliding around on the Mylar blanket. Now, I know that you have been on your toes and you've noticed that so far I haven't said anything about using a hammock. Well, there's a reason for that. I don't have one. I recently did a video called Hiking Crash Course on the Appalachian Trail, and if you have not watched that, I recommend that you would do so. In that video, I recommend that any potential AT hiker first do a section hike on the AT with the idea of getting first-hand experience of what they're capable of on the AT and what they might be able to deal with and what they don't want to put up with on the AT. And in yet another video, I told how more than once I had been so tired when I stopped hiking at the end of the day on the Appalachian Trail that I fell asleep before I could even manage to pull out my sleeping bag. What this means is I have evidence that if I tried to use a hammock on the AT, I would end up falling asleep on the ground at least several times before I could get the thing assembled. Hammocks certainly have their advantages. They don't have to be used on level ground. At some point, I'll probably try a hammock closer to home when I get the money to buy one. We don't call this flat broke outside for nothing. Which takes us back to the unfinished business of water draining around and pooling at a tent site. The heavier a rain is and the longer it lasts, the greater is the risk from running groundwater. When we pick a tent site, the first thing we want to do is look around and see ground that is lower than our tent site. The more low ground we see, the better. I would avoid pitching a tent right next to the bottom of a large slope. Such a slope might be draining a much larger area higher up that we can't see. I also would avoid anything that looks like a low and long area because that might turn into a waterway in heavy rain conditions. If it needs to be said, I have seen heavy rain run from the walls of my tarp tent and go straight into the ground when my tent site had enough elevation. And just for the record, AT hikers also can spend nights at motels, hostels, and commercial campgrounds, but I figured if they've got the money, they can figure out how to do that. And with that, we're done. If you have not yet subscribed, please do so. It would be much appreciated. And as always, thanks for watching.